Good afternoon or evening, depending on where you're at. Welcome. I'm Dr. Jennifer Pfeifer, co-director of the National Scientific Council on Adolescence and psychology professor at the University of Oregon. On September 30th, we on the council released a new brief on promoting positive mental health for early adolescents. And this brief offered 4 research-based recommendations on how middle school educators and school administrators can help students build positive mental health and well-being. We're excited to have all the authors here today to share their deep clinical expertise and experiences working directly with youth and help us talk and think about these recommendations. And we're also excited for those of you who've been able to join us. Before we start, I just want to provide some details about the format. We'll leave 10 minutes at the end of the webinar for a Q&A. So you can add your questions through the Q&A function throughout this discussion, and we'll select as many as we can to answer in the time that we have. We'll be recording this panel discussion, and we will have it available on the UCLA Center for the Developing Adolescent website after this session. So to jump directly into what we're talking about today, in the past few years, and particularly following the pandemic, there has been increased urgency around the need to support young people's mental health. And positive mental health is really essential to learning. It affects attention, engagement, and classroom behavior. Now, early adolescence is a window of opportunity to have a lasting impact on mental health. During these first few years of adolescence, about ages 10 to 13 years, young people experience accelerated physical changes related to puberty, rapid brain development, changes in self-image, and more intense peer relationships. So these changes make young people especially sensitive to their experiences and relationships during this time. Now, teachers, of course, are not mental health professionals, but the time that they spend with their students during this pivotal period of development makes them a crucial first line in promoting positive mental health and in helping to prevent mental health challenges from becoming more severe over time. The recommendations that we placed in this brief are based on 4 key areas that are especially important to positive development during early adolescence: independence, exploration, and learning, emotion and behavior regulation, building strong relationships, and sleep. To talk more about the recommendations in these key areas of development, I'm joined today by Dr. Leslie Leve, who's the Lorry Lokey Chair in Education, Professor and Department Head for Counseling, Psychology, and Human Services, and scientist at the Prevention Science Institute at the University of Oregon. Dr. Rhonda Boyd, Associate Professor in the Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and the University of Pennsylvania Perelman School of Medicine. Dr. Joanna Williams, Senior Director of Research at the Search Institute, and Dr. Ariel Williamson, who's sleep expert for the Pediatric Sleep Council, Associate Editor of Sleep Health, and Assistant Professor at the Balmer Institute for Children's Behavioral Health in the Department of Psychology at the University of Oregon. I'm excited to have you all here. Thanks for joining us. Now, each of these experts will discuss one of the recommendations and how they can help middle school students build a foundation for positive mental health. Okay, let's start with Leslie, and we'll talk about the first recommendation. If we could get that slide up, I think. There we go. So the first recommendation is to support positive experiences of independence, exploration, and learning. So Leslie, could you tell us a little more here about why was this the first recommendation and how did the research point towards this?
Absolutely. Thank you, Jen. And I'll just start by saying that we haven't ordered these in order of importance. All 4 are really quite important and actually intersect in areas that we hope you'll hear as we talk through them. But the first recommendation, because it has the word learning in it, we thought, that really does resonate with traditional thinking about the education system. So it might make sense to lead off this report with that item. So what I'd like to do is just kind of break that down because there were a lot of words there, independence, exploration, and learning. So I'll just talk through each of those fairly briefly and linking them to the research in psychology for your question, Jen. So, and you alluded to this a little bit in your introduction, but this time period, early adolescence, is really a time when youth are becoming increasingly independent. They're establishing their friendship networks and relationships outside of their immediate neighborhood and family environment, having more autonomy in their day-to-day decisions about their lives, and just generally becoming more independent from and less reliant on their parents or caregivers. So, that's not to say that that's an easy process. That can be a challenge or a struggle at times, but because, that developmental milestone that's happening during the middle school years isn't restricted to the home environment, it cross-cuts all settings, including school. It's really an opportunity for schools and classrooms to be able to create some structures, systems that could support this increasing independence, independent learning, that could help with identity development during this important developmental period. And then we know from the science there that can help promote positive school engagement, academic success, and mental health. So they're all linked together. So I'll just I'll just keep turning to the next part of that sentence, which was around exploration, which is related to independence, but it's a little bit different. And I think what the science is telling us there, the developmental science, is that it's really important during this transition period of middle school to have a space for youth to explore their interests and learn new skills. And again, that can occur, of course, in the home and community settings, but also can occur during the school setting and school context. Um, we think an important element in what the research is telling us here is that exploration can sometimes come with mistakes or missteps or failures or disappointments. But those are really critical parts of exploration that actually help build social skills and healthy relationships and mental health, and in turn, school success in the end. So it's important that youth have this exposure to some challenging activities that could provoke some mild or, but manageable stress, and that ultimately that might help with mental health and social relationships and school engagement and performance. The last part of the recommendation one was around learning. And again, here what the science tells us that the brain is just continuing to grow, to develop during this early adolescence period. And in a way, you can kind of think of the brain as learning alongside the person, the youth in the classroom and elsewhere. And what we mean by that is it's through these new experiences that might involve opportunities for independence, opportunities for exploration. The brain is actually learning those from those experiences, forming new connections, strengthening existing ones, and having that opportunity to grow and adapt along with the person as they go through the middle school years. So with those connections, having that opportunity for learning in the classroom, affecting learning and connectivity in the brain, and really refining the way the systems of cognition or academic skills are interfacing with the social skills and the behavioral health skills, both in person and at the brain level, again, is just a nice way to facilitate children's learning. So I will pause there and not take up our whole space with this first recommendation.
Thanks, Leslie. I actually wonder if you could extend that a little bit and maybe provide a specific example or two of some in-class or school level practices that could sort of support this recommendation.
Yeah, good, great follow-up, because I think, yeah, it's a much more helpful to have something concrete especially for those of you who might be in classroom settings or teachers or administrators yourself. So, and also I'd encourage anyone who is in that category of in the school to add anything to the Q&A if you have examples that you could put forward here. But I'll give one I can think of that is really focusing kind of on this independence, exploration, and learning would be, imagine if you are teaching math in middle school, and the concepts that you're trying to convey at that age are things around fractions, decimals, percentages. So one way to kind of integrate this idea of independence, identity, exploration, learning would be to have the class project focus on something, for example, around ask the students to pick any occupation, something that gives them the independence to think about that in their own way. And then use the internet, for example, to have them find out what would be a salary for that occupation. Then have them have tasks around Okay, how does that's the annual salary. What would that be at the monthly, at the weekly, at the daily level? So they're using computational skills to get those fractions in there. But by having the subject of the math question in this particular example be around something where they're having to engage independent thinking and independence exploration, and then still incorporate learning, it's a way to synthesize some of those concepts together in the classroom context and facilitate both academic achievement as well as grounding of some of the skills foundational to mental health development. Thanks.
Leslie. I wonder if I could ask one more follow-up question, which is you said something really important about, the need for exploration in adolescence, but also how part of exploration can result in mistakes and failures. And I'm just curious about if you have any thoughts you want to share about school disciplinary practices when you have that space for exploration, just sort of variability in that across schools and thinking about equity in that space.
Yeah, that's an excellent point to consider as well. And what we do know from the science is that unfortunately there are some inequities in the way that disciplinary practices are applied in school settings, with some youth disproportionately experiencing more harsh or punitive discipline. So I think an overall message, one, is to maybe use data at your school level to look at the application of disciplinary practices, but two, to really using this developmental science and thinking about just the priority of that independence and in some ways mild but safe space for risk taking. Sometimes early adolescents are going to make mistakes and missteps. That is part of healthy development and ultimately how they help develop into humans, adults that can make appropriate decisions later in life. And so just, really thinking about kind of modulating the severity of discipline when it is in the context of something that could just be normative, typical exploration. And we want to promote that as opposed to, for example, expel or suspend a student. Thank you.
Thanks, Leslie. Let's move on to recommendation 2 with Rhonda. So we'll pull up the slide here. The recommendation is to implement strategies to support healthy regulation of emotion and behavior. Now, Rhonda, can you tell us what do we mean here by healthy regulation? How does successful emotion regulation affect the health and well-being of early adolescents?
Thank you, Jen. It's important to think about the range of emotions that teenagers can experience. It ranges from joy to anger to disappointment, fear, and a host of emotions. One of the things, there is no negative or positive, variance necessarily about emotion. We all experience them. Emotions become more complex as we've been talking about. These early adolescents, life is becoming more complicated. Their bodies are changing, their social interactions are changing, and so their emotions are changing. They may not fully understand all their emotions. They may not understand that you may experience multiple emotions at one time, and all of that can be overwhelming to them. And so part of it is that we want to sort of normalize that they have emotions, whether they may be viewed as positive or negative, but also the way they express it is normal. What we want to really focus on is sort of being able to help these young adolescents be able to identify and be aware of their emotions, to label them, to begin to understand their emotions. Also, to be able to manage these emotions. Part of what may happen is that you want to keep it in kind of the normal range or some kind of normal range that is not too extremes, that someone may not be too fearful that they won't be able to function or spend a long time in emotion in which it can have a negative impact. So we wouldn't want a teen to be sad for weeks. It's okay to be sad for a couple hours. And so those are the things. And then also the roller coaster that people always see with teens, that one minute they may be feeling this way, one minute they may seem this way. And that is normal. And many times they may be based on how they may be feeling inside. It could be based on external situations that are happening. And so we want teens to be able to identify this and be able to keep it in a sense that they're not reacting. And we also, what's important is to experience something, to have a feeling, but be able to think before you respond. That piece that often does not happen. And so those are the things that we want to be able to teach teens to be sort of this healthy regulation. That, they may experience anger or sadness at points, but that they are able to come out of it and to experience something else and be able to control it and not have their behavior react in a way which puts them or others at risk. And so those are the things that we are looking for. And I think it's also important to recognize that these teenagers are going through and experiencing a lot of different things. There's situations at school, in the family, in their extracurricular activities. They're dealing with stressors in their communities, situations that are happening in the world, discrimination, maybe poverty. And so they are trying to process and handle all of those things that are happening in the world, as well as their own emotional well-being. And so these things, of their ability to be able to manage this, helps them later on, when many times some of the consequences matter much more when you're dysregulated. Dysregulation can lead to difficulties in mental health problems later on, could lead to problems with work and being able to function in society as a citizen.
Thanks, Rhonda. One of the things that I love that you said early on there is just that emotions, it's not unhealthy to have emotions, and that we need to remind ourselves that emotions are a normal part of the human experience, and to, take the perspective of adolescents managing all the different range of experiences and changes that they're facing. I was going to ask you a sort of similar question to what I asked Leslie about if you can think of some, we kind of touch on a couple of potential strategies that educators might want to look into in supporting development of healthy emotion regulation skills in the report. Do you want to share anything about that for our listeners?
Yes, in the report, we discuss about teachers being able to work on healthy regulation for emotions and behaviors in classroom settings. This can take place, in group-based, but also teachers and educators are interacting daily in many ways with the teenagers. And so they're able to sort of help them label their feelings when they see situations. You can imagine someone gets a paper back of an essay, a teenager, and they may not have gotten a grade that they wanted. They may react in a way that may be seen as anger, but oftentimes that behavior could be actual disappointment, maybe. And so I think helping label these more complex feelings with you and sort of figuring out how you handle those things. And teachers can see it. They may not know all the situations, but certain situations they may be aware of, maybe how helping them label it, being able to discuss it, and being able to use the classroom as a way of normalizing that these different types of feelings. We also recommend mindfulness, which is an evidence-based intervention that's been used in a lot of settings, in which you teach teens to be present and focus on the here and now. So they're not maybe worrying about the future, what are my grades later, how sometimes thinking about what's going to happen in college when they're only in middle school, you stay present, and also not maybe worrying about the past. And it can be used, the mindfulness, in all settings. They can use it if they're in a club or they're playing sports. Of learning those type of skills can be done sort of classroom based. And so teachers have this wonderful opportunity to actually manage and help and model it themselves of healthy ways to regulate their emotions when things happen.
That's a really wonderful set of suggestions. And for those of you who are listening, if you go to the report, there's some links out to see some sort of elaboration on some of those strategies and tools, like how to promote mindfulness. Okay, does any other panelists want to add, or should we move to recommendation number 3? I'm going to move to recommendation number 3 because I just see smiles. Okay, recommendation number 3 is to encourage youth to build strong relationships. Joanna, would you like to discuss this with the group?
I would be very happy to. So we know that for all of us, really, social connections are so important for well-being. We're really kind of all wired to be engaged and connected with others and to be in relationships. And for adolescents and young adolescents in particular, social connections with adults, these might be our teachers, our parenting adults, other caregivers, as well as positive peer relationships, are critical to healthy development. We're all motivated to connect with others, and we learn from our relationships. In the context of schools, and for young adolescents in particular, we know that friendships and school belonging are linked to well-being and can protect against negative mental health outcomes. So I want to talk separately, I think, about peer relationships first, and then thinking about sort of adult-youth relationships in schools. Peer relationships support social development. And as Rhonda and Leslie have already talked about, there's a lot of change that's happening in early adolescence. Some of it we can't see, all the behind the scenes stuff that's happening in terms of, the kind of blossoming and changing of our neural networks, hormonal shifts that are happening across the period of adolescence. All of those things are happening at this really dynamic time. And we're learning things that we can see. So peer relationships help our young adolescents develop social skills. So things like how to communicate, how to resolve conflicts, how to make decisions together and sort of problem solve together. They support interpersonal goals. We think about building a sense of empathy and tolerance. They can help foster belonging. And then peer relationships in many ways are a practice opportunity for adult roles that young people are working towards. They've got plenty of time as young adolescents. I mean, some of them have adult responsibilities at that time, but as we're thinking about adolescence as a period of sort of development and testing and experimenting and learning, it's an opportunity to learn how to collaborate, how to think about healthy competition, how to build intimacy. So all of those are sort of functions of peer relationships. In addition, they can be a source of emotional support. Our peers can socialize our behavior. We're often drawn to peers whose behavior and values are similar to ours, and we may be influenced by peers who are new. We're sort of exposed to new ways of understanding the world. Peers can support identity development and meaning making. It's a time when young people are especially attuned to sort of social inputs and social information. So we are often learning from the relationships that we have in early adolescence in ways that help us understand like who we are, who we want to be, where we fit in, how we sort of see ourselves and how we think others see us as well. I don't want to get too technical, but I will talk about some of the changes that are happening behind the scenes, and we reference these in the report as well. So I've mentioned puberty. We know that puberty is catalyzing some changes that sort of heighten our sensitivity to social inputs when we are in this 10 to 13 age range. And it seems that sensitivity to sort of social and emotional information is really starting to become more intense in early adolescence and beginning to peak relative to childhood or, later stages of development. We've got increasing sensitivity to social information, and we're still developing skills. So younger adolescents are still building important skills on recognizing emotions that Rhonda just talked about. That's not only recognizing their own emotions, but it's even about processing the emotions of others. And relationships become one of those contexts where they're able to sort of practice that. We're also, when we're young, still learning to regulate our responses, as Rhonda talked about, to social information. And when we've got youth who are sort of kind of sensitive to rejection, it can be even more difficult to sort of develop some strengths and some competencies in these areas. So all of these sort of speak to the role of relationships as kind of almost a playground for building the skills that we need moving forward. Just like Rhonda mentioned, there's a lot of contextual changes that are happening in young adolescents. Even for many of us, the way that we structure schools, if young adolescents are moving into middle school, they're often around peers that they've never met before, who may be from, different neighborhoods. So it's often a great point in time for exposure to sort of, diverse experiences and new people. And that means learning about, new norms and new values. It's a time when, in the best sort of scenarios, young people have a lot of time to be in relationship with peers. They've got a little more autonomy. So I think, I can't overstate the importance of peer relationships. Adult youth relationships are equally as important, especially in middle school. So when we think about what young people need, relationships are this context for learning, but they need some scaffolding and support. So when I think about a classroom setting, there are these great opportunities for educators, not only to build relationships with their students, but to help to help their students practice relational skills. And that may be in sort of formal classroom activities where they're doing kind of group work. And it may be more one-on-one, but I think kind of understanding that the importance of relationships to young people. I think most middle school educators and educators of young adolescents know this because they live it on a day-to-day basis. But really being attuned to the relational culture of a classroom can go a long way. Let me pause there and see if you want to jump in with any questions, and I'm happy to talk a little bit more about teacher-student relationships as well.
Yeah, I really love how you highlighted the way these recommendations are actually quite interconnected, and supporting and promoting any one of them you can see how that can spill over and promote the others as well, or connect with them. But I would actually love it if you would expand a little more on these, like the teacher early adolescent relationships.
Yeah. So some of what we highlight in the report are generally just the benefits of strong teacher-student relationships. And we know from the science that when young people say that they have strong relationships with teachers, almost more so than strong peer relationships, they feel a stronger sense of connection and belonging in their school settings. And that is really important for thinking about positive mental health. If you feel like, you don't fit in when you come to school every day, then that's going to potentially lead to sort of negative trajectories of development. So we want students to walk into a school and feel like this is a place where, people know who I am, where I feel like I'm seen and then my identities are affirmed. People sort of understand me. And I think a lot of that, educators do a lot, and I give all credit to all they do to support the development of young people. And one of the ways in which I think I wonder how much they even recognize how important this is to young people, but it's just getting to know a little bit about the youth that they interact with. And that may be, for some educators, like dozens and dozens, if not, more than 100 youth in a day. So it can be challenging. But there are ways that, at the beginning and throughout the school year of just small check-ins. There's some research that focuses on what we call identity affirmations, where you just ask a personal question to a young person about something that's important to them. So it may be something related to, an aspect of their social identity. It may be related to, a personal value. Maybe they really value family, or maybe they have a passion or a talent that they're really excited about. They go home every day and look forward to doing X or seeing this person. Whatever it is, asking those questions and then, receiving that information so young people know this person, the adult in my classroom or the adults that I see throughout the day know a little bit more about me than what might be coming out in my classwork or my academic performance or other school-related tasks. And I think that can go a long way in sort of supporting the connections that help build sort of strong, a positive foundation for mental health. As you heard in the introduction, I'm at Search Institute, and we do a lot of work with educators on thinking about dimensions of relationships that are sort of in addition to young people feeling cared about or feeling supported. We know in our work that educators often do a really good job of challenging young people's growth by holding high expectations. And that's another important dimension of relationships. So I'd like to think about relationships as, being sort of multidimensional. We all want to feel cared about. We want to feel supported. But, especially in school settings, young people want to know that educators expect that they are able to succeed with the right kinds of supports. So having high expectations and challenging young people to grow can be really beneficial. In addition, I think relationships, particularly between adults and youth, can expand opportunities. So you can connect young people to information and resources and other people in the community through the relationships that adults and young people have in schools. And then last, because we're talking about young adolescents, this is a time when, feeling like you have some autonomy, feeling like you've got opportunities to actually give back and contribute. And, young adolescents are really attuned to a sense of fairness and often sort of care about social status. So for adults, that means thinking about ways in which we share power with young adolescents. So when we're doing sort of thinking about different ways to get to different dimensions of relationships, beyond just the important sort of core aspects of caring about our students, I think those can go a long way as well for supporting a sense of not only overall well-being, but I think understanding that if I know my young person, I know like how to support them when they've made a mistake, or how to support them when they're dealing with some relational conflict that often bubbles up in middle school. So when young people feel that trusting relationship, they often know that adults can be relied on to support them in building some of those relational skills.
Joanna, I loved all those concrete suggestions. That was awesome. I'm going to weave in a question here from the Q&A before we move on to our fourth recommendation, which is basically whether the advice here that we're sharing is any different for adults who are working with young people in third spaces like mentoring, after-school programs, extracurriculars instead of teachers. So I know a lot there you were talking about teacher-student and school spaces, but really for anyone, anyone here on the panel, if you want to kind of weigh in on that, what do you think about this? If any of this advice you want to just reaffirm or adjust, for third spaces.
I'll start by saying that I think the general ideas of understanding young adolescents, sort of like the developmental importance of relationships, is important regardless of the spaces that they're in. And I would also say, and this is related to the work we do at Search Institute, we partner a lot with schools and third spaces as well, out of school time, youth serving organizations. And our approach to relationships is always about understanding these multiple dimensions and how it's beneficial when youth are able to feel cared about and supported, but when they also feel, like they've got opportunities to be challenged, to have expanded, opportunities and, growing social capital, as well as opportunities to share power. I think what changes though for me in schools it's really the time that you're able to invest in those relationships can look very different. If you have a classroom of 25 to 30 young people, I think for educators who you may see for maybe 45 to 90 minutes in a day, and maybe it's not even 5 days a week, the ways in which, like the strategies you might have to use to sort of build those relationships, foster a sense of connection between adults and students, to navigate the dynamics that change day to day when your 25 to 30 young people enter the room, can feel a little bit different. So the strategies might be different when you're talking about that setting. In youth development settings, oftentimes you may have a little bit more flexibility, a longer time to engage in relationship building. And you might not have necessarily, depending on the nature of a program, some of the constraints. Third spaces are also a great place for some young people, or for many young people, to really dig into identity supports. We don't want to overlook that even, at 10, 11, 12, young people are thinking about who they are. And those questions are ones that they can't necessarily navigate only on their own. So creating spaces that are affirming those identities becomes really important for relationship building as well as supporting positive mental health overall.
I would agree that the emotional regulation, building healthy regulation is something that adults can do in third places. They can help youth be aware of their emotions, help them label it, and also manage. And there will be different stressors or things that will happen in these third spaces. And so they can use that information sort of to help youth sort of understand and manage their their emotions, and as well as regulate their responses and fit in with the expectations of the third space. And also, as I mentioned before, modeling the behavior for the teens. So this does fit across all other settings, and particularly, which I didn't mention before, is also important to think about the cultural context in which emotions are expressed. So certain youth with certain backgrounds or cultures, emotions may be expressed differently. And so if the adults in their lives are aware of that, can help facilitate that fits along their cultural values.
A really great point. Yeah. Leslie?
Yeah, I'll just chime in. I really like Joanna and Rhonda, your points, and I would agree that for the first recommendation around, independent exploration, learning, that would also apply in third settings. And in fact, it's a little bit, often there is more space for those exploration and independent learning, depending on the nature of the third setting. So more opportunities to craft, whoever is leading those settings, to craft opportunities or structures that could allow exploration and independence, but still having some, guardrails on there in terms of creating a safe space so that some of the peer relationships can be fostered along the lines of what Joanna was speaking to. And then the other thing I would say, and this often is not in the purview of the person organizing or leading the third space, is just that because those third spaces can be such an important avenue or venue for promotion of youth mental health, really thinking creatively about where and when they're offered to help ensure that there will possibly be access to all students who may have family or other kinds of obligations after school. Just thinking about creative ways. Again, this may not be feasible or in the purview of the person directing that third space activity, but just because they can be so beneficial, how can we increase access for all middle school age youth?
Great points. Let's get into our fourth recommendation here, which is, I'm gonna get that slide pulled up here, to implement practices that support healthy sleep habits. I'm really excited here for Ariel to flesh out this recommendation for us.
Yes, happy to be here. Thanks so much for having me. I think, this recommendation really does converge and support all of the other recommendations. I'm a little bit biased because I talk a lot about sleep and think a lot about it. But, sleep is a pillar of health. And we know, especially for youth, that sleep and mental health and well-being are closely linked. Sleep is really relevant to every single domain. So we know that when adolescents are sleep deprived or not getting enough sleep, they're more likely to be inattentive and have trouble regulating their emotions, which makes it really hard to learn and also to engage in some of those healthy strategies to help with regulation. We also know that relationships can suffer. So adolescents may be more irritable or, really kind of feel some of their mental health symptoms that they may be experiencing more, like anxiety, so rumination, bad mood, sad mood, all of that can be more challenging when you are not sleeping well. And I think, with sleep habits, I do want to clarify too that, there's sleep health, which is like getting, the optimal timing for adolescents. It's 8 to 10 hours in a 24-hour period. That's the guidelines. And, things like having a regular bedtime, avoiding caffeine, avoiding use of electronic devices overnight or when falling asleep. But there's also kids who experience sleep problems, and they're doing all of those healthy habits that are recommended. So because we know sleep and mental health are so closely linked, lots of kids have trouble falling asleep. They may be waking up overnight. And I think, a key part of this recommendation is really seeing the whole picture of adolescent sleep and being really aware of the significant shift that is just typical, especially in this 10 to 13-year-old period. All of these sleep concerns sometimes are brought on by puberty, and the transitions that come with it. So, to integrate what Joanna also had referred to, this onset of puberty comes with these bioregulatory changes in body clocks or circadian rhythms. So with the onset of puberty, teens' brains become wired so that melatonin, which is the hormone we need to fall asleep and remain asleep, it gets produced later. They also are, not able to become sleepy as early as they were earlier in development. So everybody has a sleep drive that builds up during the day. It builds up slower in adolescence relative to any other period prior to that in development. So it's really typical for adolescents or early adolescents to start having trouble falling asleep. Bedtimes may need to shift later. They also have more autonomy. They may own their own devices, and maybe that's a really important time to connect with friends socially via the internet or get homework done, all of these different things. So because of that, we really want to think about supporting sleep at different levels. It can be hard to do in a classroom per se. We can talk a little bit more about concrete examples, but this science of adolescent sleep and the shift that comes around in adolescence is exactly why we advocate for having middle and high schools start no earlier than 8:30 in the morning. And that's a recommendation that, is supported by the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Centers for Disease Control, and many other organizations.
Thanks, Ariel. That was really helpful. I like how you peppered some important sleep facts in there that are good for educators to know, things that they can potentially try to share on. And those things are actually in the report if you want to connect back out to the report and see those summarized there so that they can. I think part of this reminds me a little bit of the emotions part of the conversation. When knowledge is power. So if you know that emotions and emotional changes are going to be happening, or that sleep changes are going to be happening, it helps equip families and adolescents to start to strategize how to deal with them. And also, again, informs recommendations for how schools should accommodate those things. But I think if I could have you expand a little more on that, just again, drawing that connection between what can educators do or what can be done in school settings, in addition to some of the things you've already mentioned in the sleep space.
Definitely. So, in addition to if you're looking for a cause to advocate for, you can advocate for later school start times. I will say just one more point about that. Often a concern from educators and others, which is really well founded, is that if you change middle and high schools, everything else changes, right? For kindergarten all through 5, everybody else is changing, for sports, all this stuff. We do have some really exciting new research that shows that after making those changes, there really wasn't a negative impact on kids and teachers and caregivers in other school settings. So like in K-5 schools when their middle and high school changed. So that's an important point. It is kind of a logistical challenge, but I think, in the classroom, because of these issues with sleep that emerge, both due to, the kind of typical adolescent development and that later shift, but also the onset of new emotions, new experiences, hormones, mental health symptoms, all these things can contribute to sleep difficulties. And so educators probably are seeing kids fall asleep in class. And I think that, of course, we want to redirect that behavior, but also really taking that behavior as a sign of not an adolescent being lazy, not a lack of parental monitoring or support, but rather a sign that maybe that adolescent is struggling. It may just be that they had a tough night, but they also could be struggling with a mental health or a sleep-related concern, and they were up at night. It could be that as much as their family really values sleep, their parents may work shifts that don't allow them to be home at a certain time, or the adolescent may work or have childcare responsibilities. They also might be sleeping in an environment that isn't really optimal for sleep. It can be loud and noisy both in the home and outside of the home. We also know that for some students, they may not feel safe at home. So I think I would encourage educators, to really avoid punitive discipline policies, even saying like, hey, come on, don't be lazy, wake up. We don't want to send those messages that kids are lazy, unmotivated, aren't trying, or don't care because they're sleeping in class. Even if maybe a student says they don't care and they want to just sleep, I would suspect there might be another set of issues going on, potentially with, grappling with mental health symptoms, stress at home, stress at school, etc. So I think that, one of the top things educators can do is really approach that situation thinking about the broader context, thinking about health inequities that we know are really persistent and are due to these different social and environmental factors that can impact sleep, as well as overall well-being and development, especially in early adolescence. Teachers are doing lots of different things. So, giving sleep tips might not really be feasible. And sometimes adolescents will get kind of upset if you talk to them about just put your phone down, because it's not usually that simple. But I think just encouraging the value of sleep, time for sleep, and really avoiding those punitive approaches and having that awareness of just how typical it is for adolescents to have trouble falling asleep early and trouble getting up early for school.
Thanks, Ariel. I just really appreciate how clear you make that recommendation. What we are going to sort of start shifting here to open Q&A, and while we wait for the questions to come in, because I don't see any there yet that we haven't answered, I wanted to draw some connections across what we've been talking about today, which is that, if you logged into this webinar or you're watching the recording later, you might be thinking about why we chose to the framework that we chose and how we're talking about strategies that on the one hand may seem like really kind of simple, right? We're talking about strategies that are would be helpful for all youth, for all the early adolescents. And that was really intentional on our part in the report. We're presenting a very particular framework where we want to talk about promoting early adolescent mental health universally and doing things that will help prevent the emergence or escalation of mental health challenges. So I was wondering if, while we wait for questions in the Q&A, anyone wants to expand a little bit on the value of a promotion and prevention framework for thinking about early adolescent mental health.
I'll jump in first, although I imagine Rhonda and Leslie, I will defer to your expertise as well. But I just want to make a couple of comments. One of the things I think is important about mental health and the way that we sometimes talk about it in sort of a broader national level as we frame some of the challenges or some of the crisis framing, and we lead with concerns, and those concerns can be very valid. But I feel like being reactive to when there is an actual negative mental health challenge requires a different set of resources. And in the report, we refer to, when we're thinking about crisis intervention, there's some, in the kind of addendum section, there's some information there. But imagine if we were able to invest in promotion for all young people. Like, if we think about pathways moving forward, we're then investing in not having to intensely become reactive to negative mental health sort of crisis kinds of moments. And it's not foolproof. I mean, every individual young person is different, and there's lots of complexities beyond, what they experience during the school day. But I think it's really critical to understand that early adolescence is not only this great period because there's these dynamic changes, it's also a really critical period where we can change pathways. We can change young people's developmental pathways for the better because they are, taking in information and learning, and, neural connections are forming, and they're sort of exquisitely attuned to experiences that they have. When we're thinking about promoting positive well-being, and preventing sort of negative well-being, those changes can really stick, and we can think about like thriving pathways moving forward by taking some time to focus on promotion of what we know young people need during this time.
I'll just add on to what Joanna said. I mean, part of what the strategy of focusing on in middle schoolers and education system is that majority of young people are there. And so when you think about from a prevention and health promotion aspect, that interventions that can be delivered and touches to help promote their mental well-being is helpful at that sort of larger level. And then it may be clear of the kids who need more. So if you do strategies, and then it's like, oh, these kids need extra strategies that may go on, because everyone at least have the same chance of getting things that will promote their learning, their independence, their social interactions, and their emotional well-being. And so that's how we look at it, in the sense that we can do a more population-based approach.
And I'll just I really love, Joanna and Rhonda, what you just said. And just to chime in with one more point there, is that we also know that prevention tends to work well or be most effective in these times of change or developmental change and uncertainty. And that's really what this middle school period is. You're going from being in elementary school, where you've likely just had one teacher in the same group of children, to a larger school setting, multiple teachers. At the same time, you're experiencing these, changes in biology and hormones and puberty and social skills and this identity seeking and independence. And so at that time, developmentally, when there's those changes going on both within person and in your context, it's really an opportune time to think about prevention, because things can go wrong. You're a new person, you're in a new setting, and so it's just a great time to do those little preventative course corrections to help get kids on the right step during middle school, to help them make that leap then to the next transition of high school.
Yeah, absolutely. Something I think that we think about as the council often is the idea of amplification of small changes, small interventions, small touches early on, leading to much better outcomes than you might have expected from the size of the change that you were initiating initially. And so I think that this, I just wanted to reinforce how valuable and what an incredible role that educators can play, and other adults in third spaces can play for promoting early adolescent mental health, with, again, some of these strategies that are within reach, that are outlined in this report. You don't have to be able to be a licensed practicing clinician to support youth mental health. There's so much that we can do. Are there any other questions here? I'm looking at our Q&A. Wanted to make sure. Oh, I see a go for it with it.
I think, I always wanted to say something about sleep. So I know it might not seem like what small change could we make? But really, I do want to emphasize that sometimes those national guidelines on sleep might seem unattainable. Like educators might be looking at them and be like, I don't know when I got more than 6 hours of sleep. But really, even a 30-minute difference in sleep duration in experimental studies with early adolescents have shown that it results in better attention and neurobehavioral functioning. So planning, organizing, shifting between tasks is better even with 30 more minutes of sleep. Even just knowing that night wakings are normal, and maybe having the practice of keeping the clock turned around, because otherwise you're just clock checking, or making it really an important practice if teens, refuse to get those those phones or devices out of the room, that they're charging across the room with notifications turned off at a certain time. That really can help so that kids aren't using those things overnight. So, I think making sure that, these are attainable strategies, and, we've thrown a lot out there. You can't do everything. And I'm sure others have thoughts on that too, but I think even those small changes or increased awareness about some of these things can go a long way with regard to prevention.
I'll just chime on, Ariel, because I think that's a great point, is that this group and those who help with the report really tried to make the recommendations be as low burden as possible. Sometimes it is just doing what you're doing, but realizing that that's what you're doing, maybe doing a little bit more of it in the classroom setting, because we just really acknowledge the heavy burden that teachers in schools are facing and that their time is limited. So although some of these may seem very small or incremental, that's with the knowledge of the burden, the important role that teachers have and the heavy workload they have, and also very consistent with this prevention framework of just a little bit here can make a big difference down the road.
Absolutely. We're chalking up a lot of wins for the small changes and the early investments here. Well, I don't see any more in the Q&A. Does anyone else, Rhonda, Joanna, anyone want to add one last? Oh, I just saw a question come in. This is perfect. We have time for one question. I'm going to share it here. It says, I'm involved in an early morning program for middle schoolers that runs before school. The program focuses on mentoring and movement, physical activity opportunities for youth. How can educators involved in the program offset the potential impact on sleep this program might have, because the youth have to get to school at 7 a.m. for this programming versus 9 a.m. when the school starts?
That's a great question. I think it's often this balance, right? Because you want kids to get to bed early, but maybe there's an evening social activity or sports activity that's super important. I think that for this type of program, I think talking with kids and families about the amount of sleep that's recommended and how they can get close to that. And then really monitoring, for kids who maybe it's just not really feasible and they're having a tough time in the afternoon. This sounds like a really important program. I mean, both mentoring and physical activity, that's great. We also know that with a consistent wake time, usually your rhythm can, shift earlier. For adolescents, doing things like avoiding naps late in the afternoon. If they take an afternoon nap at, 5 or 4, they're probably not going to get to bed on time to get up for that 7 a.m. program. So some of that education can be helpful, that, when you're doing this program, here's some things to keep in mind. That being said, it's not possible to get in bed, at like 9 p.m. every single night, although we wish we all could. We wish we all could. I don't know if the youth do, but that really sounds like an amazing program. And I think you can look at startschoolslater.net, which has a lot of adolescent-focused resources and evidence-based sleep guidance that may be helpful there.
Oh, thanks, Ariel. That was super helpful. This has been a wonderful discussion, but we are unfortunately out of time. So I just want to say, on behalf of the National Scientific Council on Adolescence and the UCLA Center for the Developing Adolescent, thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, speakers. Thank you, attendees. As a reminder, you can access the video from this session and other resources on the CDA website later this week. The link was there in the chat, and we'll be sending an email with links to the resources that came up in our discussion today, if you registered. And if you have any questions or need anything else, feel free to contact our communications director, Megan Forder, at meganforder@ucla.edu, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks all.